In the summer of 2023, a small team from the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland opened a series of enclosures deep inside the Cairngorms National Park and watched 19 of the rarest mammals in Britain step into wild Highland air for the first time in their lives. Each cat wore a GPS collar. Each had been bred in captivity for this exact moment. 5 years earlier, the species they belonged to had been declared functionally extinct in Britain. 11 months later, in late May 2024, the project's trail cameras captured something the team admitted they had not dared to dream about. Footage so significant that the field manager called it the most exciting moment of the entire project. What those cameras recorded changed the trajectory of one of the most desperate conservation efforts in European history, and answered a question that biologists had been losing sleep over for nearly a decade. This is the story of how Scotland tried to bring back the Highland tiger, what it took, what almost stopped it, and what those trail cameras finally revealed. Most reintroduction stories focus on big, charismatic species: wolves, bears, bison. This one is about a 6-kilogram cat that almost no one outside the Highlands has ever seen alive in the wild. And yet, what happened to it in 2024 may be the most important small mammal recovery moment in modern British conservation. Every claim in this video is sourced from the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, NatureScot, the Cairngorms National Park Authority, and the Saving Wildcats Partnership's published monitoring data. This is not speculation. This is what GPS collars, veterinary records, and trail cameras actually documented. But before you can understand what those cameras found, you need to understand what the Scottish wildcat actually is and how close Britain came to losing it forever. The Scottish wildcat is not a stray. It is not a feral tabby. It is not a domestic cat that went wild. It is Felis sylvestris, Europe's only native wild felid still surviving in the British Isles, a separate species from the domestic cat with a lineage that has existed in Britain for thousands of years. An adult male can weigh up to 8 kilograms, larger and more muscular than a typical house cat, with a thick, blunt, distinctively ringed tail tipped in solid black. It is a stalking ambush predator, silent, solitary, and so elusive that locals who have lived in the Highlands their entire lives have often never seen one with their own eyes. The Highlanders have a name for it that captures both its rarity and its reputation. They call it the Highland tiger. Once, this cat ranged across the entire mainland of Britain. It hunted in the forests of England and Wales, in the borders, across the lowlands of Scotland, and through the great Caledonian pine woods of the Highlands. It is built for that habitat, long-legged, thick-coated, perfectly camouflaged against bracken, heather, and the dappled understory of native woodland. As an apex small mammal predator, it shaped populations of voles, mice, rabbits, and ground-nesting birds. It was, in ecological terms, a keystone of British woodland biodiversity. Later in this video, you will see exactly what those trail cameras captured 11 months after the release. The footage represents a moment that the project's lead scientist said no one on the team had dared to expect in the first breeding season. But to understand why that moment mattered so much, you first have to understand how Britain came within a single generation of losing this animal completely. The collapse happened in 3 waves. The first wave was persecution. Beginning in the medieval period and accelerating through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, wildcats were systematically killed by gamekeepers and landowners who classified them as vermin. Bounties were paid, and traps were set across thousands of estates. By the late 1800s, the wildcat had been wiped out from England, Wales, and the Scottish lowlands. Only a small population in the remote Highlands survived, a final refuge for a species that had once covered the entire island. The second wave was habitat loss. The native pine woods of the Caledonian forest, the wildcat's preferred habitat, had been reduced to less than 2% of their original range by the early 20th century. The cats that survived were forced into smaller and smaller pockets of suitable forest, increasingly isolated from one another and increasingly cut off from the genetic diversity they needed to remain a healthy population. And then came the third wave, the one that nearly finished them. What Scotland did next would take 5 years of breeding, cost millions of pounds, and depend on cooperation between zoos, landowners, gamekeepers, and the European Union. And it almost wasn't approved in time. As feral domestic cats spread across rural Scotland in the 20th century, they began breeding with the few remaining wildcats. The hybrid offspring were viable, fertile, and indistinguishable to the untrained eye from either parent. Over generations, the genetic line of the pure Scottish wildcat began to dissolve into a sea of mixed ancestry. By 2018, when the International Union for Conservation of Nature's CAT specialist group conducted a comprehensive review, the conclusion was devastating. The Scottish wildcat population in Scotland was declared functionally extinct. There were no longer enough genetically pure individuals breeding in the wild to sustain the species. The numbers told the story plainly. Of 154 wild living cat samples analyzed across Scotland by the RZSS Wild Genes team, not a single one scored above the minimum threshold of 75% wildcat ancestry needed to be classified as a true wildcat. The animal that had hunted Britain's forests for thousands of years was, in the wild, gone. Saving wildcats was launched as a desperate intervention. Led by the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland in partnership with NatureScot, Forestry and Land Scotland, the Cairngorms National Park Authority, Sweden's Nordens Ark, and Spain's Junta de Andalusia, and funded by the European Union's LIFE program, the project was built on a simple but radical premise. If the wild population was beyond saving, the wildcats already in zoos and breeding centers were the species' last hope. They would be bred in captivity, prepared for life in the wild, and released back into the only landscape in Britain still capable of supporting them, the Cairngorms National Park. A purpose-built conservation breeding for release centre was constructed at RZSS Highland Wildlife Park near Aviemore. It was deliberately closed to the public. The cats inside could not be allowed to associate humans with food, comfort, or safety, because every one of them was destined for a life in which humans would be the single greatest threat. In 2022, the centre's first breeding season produced 22 kittens. In 2023, 13 more. After years of preparation, of veterinary checks, of extensive engagement with gamekeepers and local landowners, NatureScot approved the translocation license in March 2023. The first conservation translocation of wildcats in British history was authorized. Over the summer of 2023, 19 wildcats were fitted with GPS radio collars and released in small clusters into the Cairngorms Connect landscape, a 600 square kilometer block of Highland habitat managed under a 200-year restoration vision by a partnership of neighboring landowners. The release strategy was called soft release. Instead of opening transport crates and watching the cats vanish into the trees, conservationists first moved them into temporary acclimatization enclosures at the actual release sites, allowing the animals to adjust to local sounds, smells, and weather before the doors finally opened. Studies of similar projects had shown that soft release significantly reduces post-release mortality. For a species with a population this small, every individual mattered. But the biggest threats to the released cats were not the ones the team had spent years preparing for. They came from somewhere else entirely. Throughout the autumn and winter of 2023, Dr. Kerry Langridge, Saving Wildcats in situ conservation manager, led the field team in tracking the released cats daily. The GPS collars revealed insights into wildcat behavior and ecology that had never been documented before: activity patterns, habitat preferences, dispersal distances, and the way individuals moved through dense Caledonian forest and across open moorland. Most cats stayed relatively close to their release sites. A few explored more widely across Badenoch and Strathspey. The data flowed in every day. The risks were significant. Wildcats face hard winters, prey scarcity, vehicle collisions, and the constant threat of hybridization with feral domestic cats. The project worked alongside Cats Protection on a Trap Neuter Vaccinate Return program to reduce feral cat populations in the release zone, and gamekeepers across 13 estates collaborated to monitor wildcat movements and protect their territories. By the spring of 2024, 16 of the 19 cats released were still being regularly monitored by the field team. One female had died 5 weeks after release of peritonitis, an abdominal infection unrelated to the release process itself. 2 males had stopped transmitting in April 2024 and were believed to have dispersed beyond the search area. Dr. Helen Sen, the project lead, had warned from the start that some mortality was unavoidable. The survival rate was, by international conservation translocation standards, encouraging. But none of that, not the survival rate, not the GPS data, not the hours of habitat analysis, was what would define the project's first year. The thing that defined it was something the cats started doing in private, in the dense undergrowth, in places no GPS collar could record directly. The field team noticed something unusual in the GPS data of 2 of the released females. Their movement patterns had changed suddenly. Their range had collapsed. Their activity had narrowed to a small, tight area day after day. To experienced wildlife biologists, the pattern meant only one thing. The team set trail cameras, and then they waited. In late May 2024, 11 months after the first releases, the cameras captured what no one on the project had predicted in year 1. Wildcat kittens born in the wild, recorded for the first time in years on Scottish soil at 4 weeks of age, the moment they are old enough to first appear outside the den. But the wild-born kittens were only the first of 3 discoveries that would reshape what the project team thought was possible. The first discovery was the births themselves. At least 2 of the released females had given birth and successfully raised kittens to that critical first emergent stage. The project team had hoped this might happen eventually, perhaps in year 2, perhaps in year 3. Nobody had predicted it would happen in the first breeding season after release. Dr. Kerry Langridge described it plainly. The team had suspected something when the females' movement patterns shifted so dramatically. But seeing the kittens themselves on camera, she said, was the most exciting moment of the project so far. Dr. Helen Sen called it a major milestone for wildcat recovery in Scotland. Clear evidence that the cats had not just survived their first months in the wild, but had learned to hunt, establish territories, find mates, and reproduce. Everything a self-sustaining wild population needs to do, they were doing in their first year. The second discovery was behavioral, and it was, in some ways, even more significant than the births. GPS data showed that the released males and females had found each other across the vast Cairngorms landscape, completely unassisted, during the winter breeding season. In a population this small, scattered across 600 square kilometers of forest and moorland, the simple act of 2 cats finding each other to mate was statistically improbable. Yet the tracking data showed multiple male-female overlap events across the release zone. The cats were not just surviving in the landscape, they were navigating it. They were behaving like a wild population, not like a collection of released individuals. The third discovery came from the genetic implications, and this is where the experts admit they are still working out what the data fully means. While the GPS tracking confirmed that the released females had overlapped with released male wildcats during the winter breeding window, paternity could not be confirmed from camera footage alone. There remained a possibility that the kittens were hybrids, fathered by feral domestic cats rather than the released males. The team would need to wait until the kittens were old enough to safely sample before genetic profiling could determine their true ancestry. But the implication was extraordinary either way. If the kittens were pure wildcats, the project had achieved natural reproduction in year 1. If they were hybrids, it meant the released females were already breeding successfully, and the next generation of releases could be paired more carefully to outcompete domestic cats genetically. Both outcomes were forward progress. Neither had been expected this fast. In 2024, 9 more wildcats were released into the Cairngorms, and 16 more kittens were born at the breeding center. By autumn 2025, the project had released 18 more cats, bringing the total to 46 wildcats, reintroduced over 3 breeding seasons. Multiple wild-born litters had now been confirmed across 2024 and 2025. The project's premiere film, Clinging by a Claw, narrated by Outlander. Actor Sam Heughan was released to public screenings across Scotland. David Field, chair of the Saving Wildcats Project Board and chief executive of the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, called it a historic step towards securing a future for the species. Dr. David Hetherington of the Cairngorms National Park Authority described it as the most ambitious wildcat conservation project ever undertaken in Scotland. The local economic impact was already measurable, with over £2.4 million spent in the Cairngorms area through the project, supporting tourism operators, local procurement, and employment. But the most important moment in the entire project remains the one captured on a trail camera in late May 2024. A small wildcat kitten, no more than 4 weeks old, stepped out of a den into Highland air. The kitten was born to a mother who had herself been born in a breeding enclosure at Highland Wildlife Park, released into the wild 11 months earlier, and had now done the one thing that mattered most. She had become the first link in a chain that the species needs to rebuild itself. In Scottish Gaelic, the wildcat has a name that survived the extinction. It is called Cat Fiad Haich, the wildcat. For more than a generation, the word existed in the language without a true wild population to describe. Highland glens and forests carried a name for an animal that, by the formal definition of biology, no longer existed in the wild. In 2018, the IUCN made it official. The word was a memory. In May 2024, on a trail camera in the Cairngorms, the word became a living thing again. 46 wildcats, 3 years of releases. A population that had been declared functionally extinct in 2018, now producing wild-born kittens in the heart of the Cairngorms. The Highland tiger has not been saved. The threats, hybridization, habitat fragmentation, road mortality, and harsh winters are all still there. But for the first time in modern conservation history, there are wildcats in the Scottish Highlands that are not the last of anything. They are the first of something. But Scotland is not the only country where conservationists have brought a near-extinct predator back from the brink. In our next video, we travel to a place where a much larger and far more controversial animal was released into a landscape that had been waiting for it for centuries. And what happened next divided ranchers, scientists, and politicians for years. If you thought the return of one small cat was significant, wait until you see what happens when an apex predator 20 times its size walks back into a forest that has not heard its howl in living memory. You will not look at rewilding the same way again.